Episode 2 of the new feature on the channel, which is 10-minute fighter reviews, and we're going to do this one on David Haye, under the presumption that he has actually already retired. Let me first start by saying David Haye is actually a difficult fighter for me to sum up. If you think of him as a heavyweight, I don't actually believe his form is as strong as you might believe given the amount of hype and talk around him. For me, his major success was actually as a cruiserweight. But I think what David Haye brings to the table, above and beyond his resume, is actually the way he performed. What an entertainer he was, what an exciting fighter. So, I mean, just to sum David Haye up briefly as a fighter before I even get on to talking about his resume, I view David Haye as one of the most athletic, entertaining and explosive heavyweights, or fighters of any weight, as it is. I view him as a guy who was incredibly fast, he was incredibly good at switching the reins, and was a really, really massive power puncher. The way I picture David Haye is circling on the outside, staying outside of an individual's jab, keeping it long, and then he'd just be able to move in with immense speed and find himself a foot in front of the opponent and landing up in close. Obviously, he's famed for his haymaker, which is his big punch. But for me, David Haye is a guy who has excellent punch variety, can knock you out with either hand, can knock you out with a variety of punches. Everyone remembers the long, straight punch that he wobbled Nikolai Valuev with, for example, or the barrage that he took Audley Harrison down with. But let's remember how he stopped Derek Chisora up close with his back to the ropes, short hook. So for me, David Haye, in terms of the attributes he brought to the ring, not the biggest guy for a heavyweight, but very big for a cruiserweight, incredibly athletic, excellent at sort of staying on the outside. I was really impressed with his head movement and evasiveness in the Vladimir Klitschko fight. He was really able to kind of negate the Klitschko jab to some extent by just staying on the outside, with his then ability to sort of rush in and kind of ambush opponents, if you like. With David Haye's power, the way he was able to hurt opponents. I remember when he dropped John Ruiz so early on, and he stopped Audley Harrison so early on. He had that constant threat, and that at any moment of the fight, David Haye had the power to change the game and had the power to get the job done, which always brought excitement to his fights. The Nikolai Valuev fight, for example, that was actually a close fight. But in the last round, when David Haye landed that punch that wobbled Valuev and that shook him to his boots, you were kind of wondering, even if in the 12th round David Haye will be able to get the job done and find the power to kind of close the show against an opponent like Valuev. In terms of his resume, David Haye for me is a guy who, as I say, was an exceptional heavyweight. Cruiserweight. Cruiserweight wins against Fragomeni for the European title. John Mark Mormek, Enzo Macronelli, and other names, make him a real excellent cruiserweight. And I know he's someone who unified that division. I think a strong argument can be made that in the context of the cruiserweight division, which as we know is a more recent invention, David Haye is one of the all-time greats as a cruiserweight. And certainly at his very, very best, there aren't too many fighters out there at 200 pounds you pick over David Haye. Just my opinion, but there's nobody in the 200-pound division at present who I would say would pose a threat to a peak David Haye when he was beating the likes of, John Mark Mormek and those sort of names. Up at heavyweight, where he's best known, for me the success is hard to weigh up. If you look at his big wins at heavyweight, Audley Harrison, Derek Chisora, John Ruiz, Nikolai Valuev, these are names who are there or thereabouts, but there's certainly a lack of a all-time great or Hall of Fame name there for me. The win over Nikolai Valuev, which arguably represents his strongest piece of form, was controversial. I've watched that fight back 3 or 4 times, and I must say, if I was judging that fight, I think I'd have been inclined to give it to Nikolai Valuev. I thought it was a tight fight, very close, could have gone either way, but I felt Valuev was the more proactive fighter who was looking to bring the fight more. So I think that's a controversial fight, and whilst Haye was certainly landing the more quality work, for me his output was a bit low and his his game plan was slightly too negative for me to award him that fight. The Derek Chisora, the Audley Harrison wins, at the time they were relevant wins. In hindsight, perhaps not the greatest when you look back at the resume. These are guys who we saw have fall from graces on other occasions. We saw Chisora go on to lose to Tyson Fury in a bad way recently. We saw, obviously, Audley Harrison suffer multiple falls from grace after that matchup. And in hindsight, looking back at that CV, it perhaps doesn't appear as strong as you may have thought at the time. The one thing I would say is all the names you fought Chisora, Fury, Klitschko, Helenius, nobody's dropped him and knocked him out in the same way that David Haye did, which yet again is a sign of his immense punching power. Unfortunately, with David Haye, whilst there are these great career highlights, people tend to forget about the fact that he was a unified cruiserweight champion. People tend to forget about the Valuev fight or the Chisora fight. What he's probably best known for is the Vladimir Klitschko performance, and I must say the subsequent excuses with the broken toe that came along with that, and also the recent sort of retirement, not retirement, withdrawing from fights, etc. And I do think that's got the potential to really affect his legacy. In my opinion, David Haye doesn't belong in the all-time great conversation. He's below that level. He's probably a top 5 all-time great British heavyweight. There's not too many guys in British heavyweight history who you'd pick over him. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's certainly names out there. You'd certainly have Lennox Lewis over him, for example, and I'm sure there's others. But, I think David Haye certainly is in that elite level of British heavyweights. But for me, his resume is just too thin. As I say, there's the controversial Valuev win, and that sort of thing. But I think he's done something to damage his legacy with the withdrawing from fights. The 2 Tyson Fury fights, the Manuel Char fight. I think there's some damage that's been done there, and people are more inclined to remember him on that sort of level. The Vladimir Klitschko performance, to me, it was a very, very uninspiring performance. I forgive him the early loss in his career to Carl Thompson. I'm happy to put that down to him being young, inexperienced, and stepping up too early on. But the Vladimir Klitschko fight, to me, showed a lack of ambition. He was losing the fight, but instead of adjusting and instead of really, really going for it and looking to bring the heat, he kind of folded tamely and was happy to become a low-output fighter who was merely surviving. In hindsight, that performance wasn't as terrible as it looked at the time. We saw Vladimir Klitschko come out and destroy Povetkin. We saw him come out and destroy Pulev. And David Haye's performance, arguably was stronger than any of those guys. So, there's certainly a suggestion that with his win over Valuev and with that form against Klitschko, if he was to return, he'd be in that sort of conversation, beneath Klitschko, but, certainly in the conversation of the Povetkins, the Pulevs, the Furies. Some of his form against Klitschko and against Chisora stacks up well with that sort of level of opposition. But it's hard to view him as higher than that level, given the performance against Klitschko. And I must say, the way he lost that day, kind of the way he sort of went on about his toe and, subsequent issues and withdrawals from fights, etc. He almost lost more credit there than he gained. And whilst saying the distance against Klitschko should be something to be applauded, he actually managed to turn people against him and actually managed to make that a poor performance with his subsequent excuses. Something that was only highlighted with the withdrawals from fights where fans had, spent a lot of money on hotels and spent a lot of money on travel to try and see him fight Manuel Char or Tyson Fury, etc. So for me, David Haye, he goes down as a good fighter. He goes down as an exciting fighter. He goes down as a real elite level British fighter, but comes short of being an elite level world fighter. I think we've seen the best of David Haye. I think his explosive, speedy style won't age well. I think that's not a style that's going to necessarily get better as you grow older. And I think we've seen the best of what he's got to offer. For me, there's some element of unfulfilled potential there. David Haye at his best was an electrifying spectacle. I've seen him fight live myself, and he brings a unique kind of excitement and interest to an event. I do think, had he been tactically more aggressive against the Valuevs and Klitschkos of this world, with his power and with his explosion, he could have gone down not just as a great cruiserweight, but also as a great heavyweight. So for me, there's some element of unfulfilled potential there. Thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts.